So, hello everyone. My name is Karina Urquhart and I'm the Executive Director at BIC and your host for this BIC Brunch event today, which is all about the importance of metadata in light of the EU Accessibility Act. So thank you for joining. I think we have attendees from far and wide, different places around the world. So thank you for making the time for this event today. I hope you find it informative. Some housekeeping before we get started. So questions will be answered or will be taken after we've had all the presentations from the speakers. Please do use the question box in there's a little toolkit on somewhere on your screen. You'll have a little toolkit with a questions box, so please do use that. And feel free to ask the questions at any time. We'll address them at the end of the session, so not as we go. So if your question hasn't been answered, don't worry, we will get to you. The event is being recorded for BIC to use in its marketing and to allow people who aren't able to attend today to enjoy the event later on. Don't worry, as an attendee, you won't be identified in the recording, and I won't mention any names when reading out any questions, so don't be shy. The recording will go onto our YouTube channel in about a month's time. Please note that while this session will explore the metadata requirements of the EAA, it should not be considered in any way to be legal advice by any individual or any organisation that is attending the event today. And we will not be addressing any business-specific issues in the Q&A. Finally, a gentle reminder that BIC is a neutral membership organisation, and as such we politely ask that all attendees and all speakers avoid any conversations or questions that might be considered commercially sensitive or anti-competitive. You will see some links as we go through the slides coming up, so don't worry. Some of them are quite long. Don't worry about having to scribble them all down. We will be sharing the slides later on, so don't worry about that. So here's the agenda to give you an idea of what's happening today. So we will have sessions from each of our speakers, starting with Wendy Reed from Rakuten Kobo, going over next to Chris Sainer from Editeur, followed by John Bell from HarperCollins, and then back to Wendy for the vendor's perspective. So she'll be talking first with her W3C hat on, and then talking finally with her Kobo hat on. As I've already said, please do make the most of this session today to ask questions of our speakers. They're here to help you if they can. And as I've already said, no attendee names will be revealed, just to reassure you of that. So don't feel you have to be shy. We'll finish on or before 1:30, hopefully. Hopefully we won't run over. We'll do our best. So before we get into the meat of the session, a little bit about BIC. So for the benefit of those of you who aren't familiar with us, and I'm sure there will be some of you on the call today, BIC is a UK-based members organisation at the heart of the book industry, creating standards, best practices and resources. We help organisations become more efficient, save money, become less wasteful and hopefully ultimately greener. We hold a unique position of trust, facilitating UK and international industry-wide collaboration to reach agreement on dependable standards and best practice in the supply chain. How do we do this? Well, we do it in a variety of ways, including running 5 strategic committees, focusing on the areas of libraries, metadata, physical, digital, and green supply chains. We offer training, events, and workshops, and execute supply chain related projects for and on behalf of our membership, but also the wider industry as well. We operate 3 industry recognised accreditation schemes, and you can find out more on our website via the link on the screen there. So that's enough about BIC. So today's session is the second one in our brand new accessibility series, which runs from July until March next year, and very possibly beyond. Our focus on accessibility group keeps coming up with more topics, so I strongly suspect this series may run for a little while beyond March next year. Today's session, though, as I've already mentioned, will be exploring the EAA requirements in light of what they mean for digital or for eBooks, both in terms of the data contained within the ePub file and also the metadata created and distributed throughout the book industry supply chain via ONIX. We'll learn about the different types of accessibility metadata, how accessibility features of digital publications can be described in ONIX, and we'll see some worked examples for that as well. We'll also have a quick tour of the W3C User Experience guide for displaying accessibility metadata, hear helpful hints and tips on how to approach your front list, how to identify and update backlist metadata, the practicalities and the processes of doing that, and the importance of communication and setting expectations with supply chain actors and or trading partners. I should mention that we'll be hosting separate sessions dedicated to the requirements for displaying accessibility information on vendor platforms, and also a deeper dive into the accessibility requirements when it comes to the content of the ePub file. Today's session is all about the metadata. So there's some dates for your diaries there. If you follow our mailing list, you can get more specific dates as we firm up the speakers and the content throughout the year. Another date for your diary, here in the UK, the Publishing Accessibility Action Group is hosting its first two-day accessibility publishing conference in person in Oxford later this month. As you might expect, there will be a particular focus on how to prepare for the requirements of the European Accessibility Act. More information, programme details, tickets, etc. can be found via the link on the screen. So, without further ado, I'd now like to invite the first of our speakers, Wendy Reed, to take the virtual stage. Wendy is Accessibility and Publishing Standards Lead at Rakuten Kobo and is a key stakeholder and contributor to W3C, where she holds numerous roles. We'll hear from Wendy today twice, but for now, she's here with her W3C hat on to talk to us on the topic of what makes an ebook accessible. And we'll also be hearing about WCAG and obviously learning more about metadata. So I'm going to switch my screen off now. Sorry, not my screen, my camera, and invite Wendy. Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, Karina, and thank you everyone for having me and having me join you all today to talk about accessibility and publishing. So first, I really wish I had hats. With my W3C hat on, as Karina mentioned, I have several roles at W3C. The most applicable to this is that I am one of the chairs of the Publishing Maintenance Working Group, which is the group responsible for the maintenance of the ePub standard as well as associated standards like ePub accessibility. But I'm also a participant in the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, which is the group responsible for the development of WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The question that I was asked to answer here today was to try and clarify what we mean when we're talking about an accessible book. If you have been spending any time in the space, or going to other webinars or other events, you've likely heard about a number of standards related to ebook accessibility or publishing accessibility, and there are a lot of them. We didn't mean to make it confusing, but there are a couple of different standards, and there's a couple of things you have to consider when looking at them. So the two main standards that you've likely heard of are WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. The latest version of that standard is 2.2. It was released in October of last year. But laws, particularly in Europe, the EN 301549, are more based on the previous version, 2.1. WCAG is a backwards compatible standard, so regardless of the version that you're adhering to, they're interoperable with each other. But in general, the best practice when you are implementing WCAG is to always go for the highest version, because it'll always carry backwards. When you're looking at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, especially from the perspective of a publisher, it might seem that there's a lot in there, and that is true because the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines were written for websites and website content. They weren't written specifically with publishing in mind. They did consider publishing, and there are things in WCAG that relate to publishing, but it isn't exclusively for publishing. And so if you're looking at the document or you're looking at any of the associated guidance, it might feel a little bit overwhelming or like a lot. What I recommend for publishers in eBooks is, and like looking at WCAG, is that a lot of the content for WCAG is not going to apply, and that's totally fine. But it is important to follow the guidance, particularly for things relating to content, media, and visual appearance and structure. There is an excellent reference called the WCAG Quick Ref that actually lets you filter the success criteria in WCAG by different tags. And that's always been a really helpful resource for me, especially if I'm trying to look up something really specific. So I highly recommend using that, especially if you just want to see things maybe related to content or related to structure. It's a very useful standard, but it is a very large standard. It covers a lot of bases. Don't be alarmed if you see it and you have a hard time connecting it to books all the time. And partly this is why we have ePub accessibility. ePub accessibility 1.0 was released several years ago. ePub accessibility 1.1 was released last year. And it is the document that takes and considers eBooks, ePub specifically, and the specific accessibility considerations for ePub. For publishers, this is a document that is going to contain a lot of information, but it's all specifically catered to your needs. It is going to contain information on the metadata that is required to be an ePub accessibility compliant book, ebook specific accessibility concerns like synchronized media, and also conformance information and how to report conformance. An important thing to know when we're talking about metadata for this document is we're actually talking about internal ePub metadata, not ONIX. ONIX is separate, it is different. I am not going to talk about ONIX. But the content in ePub accessibility is really useful and really important for publishers to consider, and it helps contextualize a little bit of WCAG as well. The last thing I wanted to point out related to our documents is that we recently, as a working group, published a document called ePub Fixed Layout Accessibility. It is not a standard, it is a best practices document or a note in W3C parlance. The goal of this document was to attempt to answer or address questions that we had heard from the community related to fixed layout accessibility, especially in light of EAA. And most of that document focuses on content considerations and how to build fixed layout content in a way that considers accessibility, while also recognizing and identifying the limitations that fixed layout presents. Fixed layout content will never be fully accessible due to limitations of the format, but that does not mean that you should give up, and it does not mean that you can't do things to make fixed layout content accessible to the people that would find it valuable, because there are accessibility advantages to fixed layout. There's just also some disadvantages as well. So I highly recommend, especially if you are a publisher that produces fixed layout content, please check it out, please review the document, and if there is any feedback, because it is such a new document, we would love to hear it. And go to the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, in light of all of these documents, that explain a little bit that accessible content, and especially if you're new to it, can sound a little bit scary, but the reality is that particularly for ebooks, it's not as scary as it sounds. The challenge to making ebooks accessible is proportional to the complexity of the book's formatting and content. So I very quickly grabbed just 3 examples of different types of content with different levels of complexity. So most content in the ebooks realm and publishing ecosystem is likely fiction or even nonfiction text content. You have all that's made up is the only image in your book may be the cover and maybe the author photo. Most of your content is going to be in text, and it's going to be structured very simply with headings and body text. That is very easy to make accessible, and likely it's already accessible or very close to it with your current publishing methods, unless you were doing something very interesting. But of course, there are more complex forms of content. So my first example is just your standard text book. It just says text. It only has 1 or 2 images in the entire book. My second example is a book that is a refillable title, but has a mix of images and slightly more complex content in addition to text. This, again, not highly challenging, but does present some challenges because things like images are going to need detailed alternative or informative alternative text. And at least in the example that I provided here, this is a wonderful book. If anyone happens to be in Toronto anytime soon, it's called Stroll, and it's a book about walking tours in Toronto. But it's filled with these beautiful hand-drawn maps and of Toronto neighborhoods. And the alternative text for this book demands that you have really good alternative text that describes what is contained in the map. My last example is a fixed layout title, it's a manga title. And this one presents other challenges. Comics are really challenging, but not impossible for accessibility. But a lot of the considerations have to be about explaining and describing what is happening visually and ensuring that you're describing it in such a way that you are conveying the story or conveying the meaning behind the images. And the example that I have here is this 2-page spread, which is the other part that's important. And we talk a bit about fixed layout accessibility around, conveying content, especially if it's spread over 2 pages in a synthetic spread. Because in this case, we have, the main character of the book looking out over what spans 2 pages and the scene. You can't get a full grasp of the scene without seeing both sides of it. This is the kind of complexity that we're talking about, especially with fixed layout, but it's not impossible to do. It's just a little bit more work. I'm going to pass it off to our next panelist to talk more about metadata.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Wendy. Really good introduction there. Yes, I think to your point, there are a lot of standards, but hopefully you've simplified. If somebody's relatively new to this, hopefully that your first slide provides a sort of simplified version of what to look at, what not to look at. If you don't look at anything else, look at these. So hopefully that's provided some clarity. And important as well to make that distinction between internal ePub metadata and then the ONIX or the external metadata, which may not be distributed by ONIX, but obviously that's the industry recommended standard and best practice. But those two need to be considered together, very important. And I want to pick up on a word that you used, the word informative alternative text. I just think that again, I'm sounding a bit repetitive, but that also is really important, that it's not just any old alternative text. So are you able to say a little bit more without running the risk of doing a whole other webinar right now on what you mean by informative alternative text as opposed to just alternative text?
Of course, yeah. It's I think a very important distinction as you describe between actually, and I'll give the example of the image that I use in the slide with the map of the hand-drawn map of the city of the neighborhood in the city of Toronto. There's alternative text by nature is subjective to people. If you gave them the same image and asked them to write a description, a textual description for it, are going to give you 2 different descriptions, and that's kind of the name of the game. But a lot of the art of alt text is related to its context. So I would say if we're talking about writing alt text for an image like this one, there's, if the image was all on its own, you might just give it something like hand-drawn map of a neighborhood in the city of Toronto and maybe name some of the streets. But considering that this is a book about walking tours and about the character and this map is structured the way it is for a reason, the alternative text that I probably would write would be much more detailed and probably describe some of the features of the map or even the context of the map. Like this is it's too small on my screen right now for me to get into the street names and things like that, but describing the neighborhood or describing some of the features of the image and why they're drawn the way that they're drawn. It's important to include context because you want, you've included an image in your book for a reason, usually to either add color or to add, you know, visualization to a concept. You shouldn't be taking that away from your users that may not be able to see the image.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thank you. That makes perfect sense. So thank you. We'll hear from you a bit later on with your Kobo hat, for want of a better word, on. And so next up, I'm delighted to welcome Chris Sainer. Again, many of you will probably be very familiar with Chris. Chris is the standards editor at Editor, and will be giving us a helpful brief recap of what the Accessibility Act is, very briefly. But just on that, just bear in mind as well that the Accessibility Act was covered. If you want more info, that was already covered extensively in our first Accessibility BIC Brunch that was held in July. And BIC members can request a copy of this by emailing info@bic.org.uk. So Chris will be highlighting the metadata requirements and implications of the Act, talking about the different types of accessibility metadata, showing us how ONIX can handle that and can describe the numerous features of eBooks or digital publications, and including, dare I say, exceptions. So please bear with us now while we swap screens. So this worked in rehearsal. Let's see what happens when we go live. So bear with us. Change presenter over to Chris. You ready, Chris?
Yep.
Coming your way.
There we go. Should all be able to see my screen now.
Yep, I can see it. Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Karina. And thank you, Wendy. So I'm going to be talking about accessibility metadata. I'd just like to say in advance that there's quite a lot of information on my slides, but it's because I've done my slides in a way that afterwards, when they're shared with you all, you've got access to that information. So I shall just be picking out certain aspects of what's on the slide, but don't worry, you'll be getting copies afterwards. So, as Karina said, I just wanted to remind us a bit about what the European Accessibility Act is, or as you can see from the slide, its full name is that directive. I'm not going to read it out. I also wanted to remind you, it's not the only piece of legislation that exists. There are legislations in other jurisdictions, either already in place or that will come up. But if you meet the requirements of the European Accessibility Act, you're probably going to meet the requirements of most other legislation because it's based on a UN declaration, the EAA, and most other jurisdictions who are doing anything are taking similar pathways. So here's a summary of the EAA, but if you want to know more, as Karina said, go back to the first webinar in this series. So a reminder that it starts applying from June 28th, 2025, next year. So that's all the services and products covered by the Act. It applies in the case of our industry to publishers and distributors, both based in the European Union and the European Economic Area, or people doing business with that area or supplying to clients in that area. It applies to digital service providers of different types, so publishers, distributors, online retailers, libraries providing digital titles, metadata aggregators, any bookseller who sells digital titles, amongst other things. It applies to certain products and services in the book supply chain because the Act covers a lot of other things that aren't part of our supply chain, but in this supply chain, it's specifically eBooks and associated metadata, e-commerce sites, including those available on mobile phones, plus e-reading devices and software. E-publications are defined as services in the EAA. It's very important. They're not a product, they're a service. And in conjunction with what we're talking about today, the Act also says that accessible digital publications must be discoverable and information must be provided through metadata about their accessibility features. So the metadata matters. And just to highlight that, I have taken 2 sentences from the full Act. If you want to read the Act or look at it, the link is on the bottom of this slide, and you'll have that later. So first sentence from one of the annexes concerning the e-publications, so making them discoverable by providing information through metadata about their accessibility features. Doesn't say which kind of metadata, it doesn't specify schema or ePub metadata or ONIX metadata, it just says must provide information about the accessibility features through metadata. And then the second sentence I've taken is from the provisions about e-commerce services, providing the information concerning accessibility of the products and services being sold when this information is provided by the responsible economic operators. So the obligation on e-commerce sites to make that accessibility information clearly available. And also bear in mind the general product and safety requirements that come into play in December of 2024. Within those, now GPSR is another EU piece of legislation, covers all products that are sold, and within that Act there are also requirements about making sure that information is provided in an accessible format for all customers. So just a reminder of what accessibility metadata we're talking about. In general, every reader, in the case of the EAA, readers, print impaired readers, has a set of requirements. Each book has a set of features that make it more or less accessible. That metadata about the book helps match the 2 profiles. So the reader can ensure that the book that they might want to purchase or borrow meets their own particular sets of needs. And what we're expecting is that publishers will collate and distribute all the accessibility metadata about their products and update as necessary. That also publishers will be sharing metadata suitable for everyone in the supply chain. So Wendy mentioned WCAG standards. It's very useful to send out that your particular publication conforms to, for example, WCAG 2.1, level AA. That's really important, but that's really important for certain parts of the supply chain. But to a general reader with who may have accessibility needs, that may mean nothing to them. So we also need to provide them with other metadata that explains what that particular product can do for them. It's also important that retailers, e-commerce sites display the metadata in a clear and understandable way, because it's also important that the information is accessible. So we must avoid, as I've just said, just using jargon. There must also be versions available. That's ununderstandable. So comprehensive metadata, structured metadata, clear metadata, all very important. So there are different types of accessibility metadata. Wendy's already touched on some of them. The accessibility metadata that's actually inside the ePub package itself. Accessibility metadata it's inside a website talking about an ePub or an audiobook. These tend to use things from schema.org or ePub's own accessibility vocabularies. You can find accessibility metadata in specific library formats like Mark 21. And then there's the accessibility metadata within an ONIX file. So this is the metadata that's made available through the supply chain for those who do not have access to the actual file, because of course not everyone has access to the ePub files. And a lot of people have to make choices prior to purchasing a product, prior to acquisition, or even prior to display, as you may not want to display something if it doesn't meet the particular needs of your jurisdiction. Within ONIX, the accessibility metadata, so ONIX, since its inception, has always been able to describe accessibility features of physical books, Braille, large print, DAISY products, and has also been able to describe digital books. And gradually, as digital publications have evolved, ONIX has evolved. Now, ONIX, it's important to remember, focuses on the features of a digital publication. ONIX cannot describe features of the end reading system, because that will vary according to what the person has. So it can only describe what the digital publication can do. And you should always look at accessibility metadata in the context of other metadata about the title, because ONIX is there to describe a product, and there's a lot of metadata that concerns the whole supply chain. There's also metadata That's important for everybody. That's important for people with accessibility needs. You need to know what language it's in. You need to know what it's about. You need to know what age range. All that is important for everyone, including people with accessibility needs. So you can't separate the different parts of the metadata. So remember, some accessibility features, some things that are considered accessibility features in the accessibility world are things that publishers will just say this is part of the product. You should keep your ONIX up to date throughout the lifetime of the product. If you realize, if you've reassessed the product, it's got you want to add more accessibility details, then you can add that to your ONIX. And start reviewing and looking at your backlist, and start adding the information you already have about those titles. Even if you only have one or two, it can do this particular navigation feature. Add what you already have to your metadata. Add information about the limitations that your product might have, because it's better to give some information than nothing at all. So just to highlight some of the parts of ONIX that are important, you've got to describe the format of your titles. So list 150, really important. How is this digital product being made available? Is it streaming? Is it downloadable? Is it both? So you're using one of these values from list 150. And then other key values, 175, you've got to say, is it an ePub? Is it a PDF? Is it something else? Really, really important to get that information in there. Also, harking back to something that Wendy's just mentioned, E200, E201 from list 175, is it reflowable or is it a fixed layout? Is it fixed format? Very important to stress, because if you say it's fixed layout, there will be limitations, and we will know there are limitations. What version ePub are you providing the file in, or what version PDF are you providing the file in? Because that will also make a difference, because there are features in the latest version of ePub 3, which say, okay, this may be more accessible than an older version. But it's also important to say when it's an older version. And then it's also important to say when you're selling products that are made up of multiple parts. It's either physical, a package that may be physical and digital, or something that has different digital elements in it. Another key part of accessibility metadata in ONIX is going back to what Wendy showed us in the slide, when metadata shouldn't be scary, accessible publication shouldn't be scary. How is that content presented? So list 81, remember that if you're not already doing it, go and look. List 81, one of the key ONIX code lists for metadata about accessibility, because here you're describing how is the content presented. Is it just text? Is it text with images? So is it text with maps? Is it an audiobook? Is it something that's text, audio, and visual? Does it have charts, diagrams? All that content type will decide what accessibility features are needed. This is expressed in ONIX using primary content type. My primary content type is text. My primary content type is audio, etc. And then product content type to say the primary content type is text, plus supplementary content is maps. This, if you want to think about it, this is the main way that the content can be accessed by a reader. And in accessibility terms, if you're familiar with schema and ePub accessibility, it's what would be called access mode. So it's the way the content is accessed. And here's a bit of ONIX describing a novel. It's published in an ePub 3.3 format. It's fully reflowable, and it's consisting of text with a cover image and a logo as the only images. And as you can see, what I've done with this one, we've describing how it works, but we've used the primary content type to say it's text, but we've also said there are images, but we're calling them decorative images. Because a cover, providing that you don't use the cover as the only means of conveying information, is purely decorative. It's good to do an alternative description for your cover, but you don't have to if it's not conveying important information. If you rely on only images to convey information, they're not accessible. If the information that's on your cover is also in your metadata, the title, the author, for an audiobook, who's reading it, how long it is, etc. If that's in your ONIX, you're fine. So you can call your covers or your logos decorative images. This makes it much easier when you're looking at backlist to think, as most backlist will probably just be text only. The other important code list in ONIX is 196, which is the code list where you can describe particular accessibility features. 3 basic components of list 196. There are codes to describe conformance. My book conforms to WCAG, etc. Certification, this has been certified by this body as being accessible. And then there's a whole set of codes that explain the different accessibility features. And again, print and print readers can look at the characteristics described by list 81 and 196 together. Publishers can describe those two, and then you can match the 2 profiles. So here's a quick overview of 196. Go away and have a look at it if you're not already looking at it, and you can see the kind of things that are described on it. Second half of it, as you see, it's quite a long list. And on that list, we do give, if you click on the asterisk on the ONIX code lists, it'll open up and it gives notes. And in those notes, there's some guidance about how that is used, etc. So for example, here we can see 2 codes 0809, unknown accessibility, when you don't yet know what accessibility features of your product is too far in advance, or it's an old product that you haven't had time to assess. Or 09 inaccessible or very limited accessibility, which you would use for probably for very old titles that you really don't think they're going to have any accessible features. And then, for example, 14 and 15, the 2 descriptions of how you use short alternative and longer alternative descriptions. On the code list, you can also declare exceptions. So as some of you may know, the European Accessibility Act does allow an exemption and 2 exceptions. You can say you're a very, very small company and there are specific criteria for that. You can say for a product that will be disproportionate burden to transform this into an accessible title, or if we created an accessible title, it will be a fundamental modification and change the nature of the title. So you can put that in ONIX. Because for certain enforcement agencies, you do need to include that metadata so they know what it is. Burden of proof is on the person who provides that. So if you declare an exemption, you have to be able to prove that. The enforcement agencies can ask you to prove it. But you should still put that in your ONIX metadata when it occurs. But along with that, if the product still has a few accessible features, put those as well, because it's better to do the small amount and say, right, it has this navigation feature or it's reflowable, than to say nothing at all. And emphasize, you do need to speak to somebody who's a legal professional about these exemptions and whether they apply to you as a company or to certain of your products. And just to show you what the ONIX looks like, it's used in a composite called product form feature, very standardized composite of ONIX that's used for a lot of different things. It's very simple to add, and it's basically a way that you can just repeat these composites in a very structured way, and it's very easy to pick out in an ONIX file. Finally, for accessibility metadata, for some products, you do need to put in accessibility hazard warnings. So ONIX has a special code list for different hazards. Covers for both physical and digital products. It's list 143, and within 143 we have the different requirements for the hazards. Obviously, this is not something you would need for most text-based products. It's when you have moving images or particular sound files. Editor has published 2 application notes specifically about ONIX and accessibility metadata. There is an essentials one, which is a basic introduction, and then there is an advanced one. The advanced one is quite long, has a lot of text, and also has some charts that you can use about the use of the different code lists and looking at how that matches up with metadata from schema. There's also, as Wendy mentioned earlier, the W3C has been working on some best practice guidelines for how to display accessibility metadata. There are 3 documents. One is a basic principles document, so an outline of the principles of displaying accessibility metadata. There's one for how to display the metadata that's inside the ePub, so using ePub and schema.org accessibility. So that's when you have access to the ePub itself and you can access the metadata inside the file. And then there's a third one that looks at ONIX metadata and how to display that. This is a draft best practice document. It's available. You can comment on it, but it's pretty complete. It's best practices. It's not you have to do it. These are not standards, so you don't have to do it this way, but it's to help the supply chain have a standardized way of displaying this information. There's also a localization project in this, so that if you're based in Finland, you would have a Finnish translation of the suggested text, or Spanish for Spanish locations. That's an ongoing project as well. So the idea is that there's a universal way of displaying a short, user-friendly text about particular accessibility features. W3C has also been working on crosswalks. So there's a crosswalk between the schema.org and ePub accessibility metadata terms and ONIX. There's a new version just being updated. There's a couple more updates to that one. It's worth looking at. And then there's another ongoing project doing a crosswalk between schema, ONIX, and the library metadata. That's again, it's a project it's getting going. Still a lot of work to do on that. But again, comments, if you work with the library section, are very welcome. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Chris. Just get my camera up. Thank you for that. Very useful information there. On the display, on the W3C user guides, are you able to, and say if not, are you able to give I don't know, highlights on things to consider for display at all? Or should we leave that for another session?
The document's so the documents try to be comprehensive without being exhaustive. So it's basically that working group has tried to look at what are the most common things, divided it into groups of metadata to give options, trying to think, this is the user experience, what are we trying to do, and cover the different parts of the supply chain. So there's a user experience that's based on professionals who need to know this conforms to WCAG, or that I can sell this, or I can put this on my library because it conforms to the standards and I know all about the standards. And then there's a user experience based on, I'm a consumer, I'm looking for something because I have a particular need, or I'm looking for something for my child, or I'm looking for something for pupil in my class, and therefore I'm looking. So try to take an approach like that as well, and grouped it by different needs. It's tried to take a practical approach, and again, it's a W3C document, so it's open for consultation, for draft. It's not something people are trying to impose. It's very much best practices and guidance.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I thought your point on exceptions, or just hearing about how to communicate exceptions, was interesting. I think what we have to bear in mind all the way through this is why we're doing this. Yes, you've got the EU Accessibility Act, but in a way more than that, it's to enable people with accessibility needs to be able to experience search, discovery, purchasing, making purchasing decisions in the same way that people without accessibility requirements do. So the more information that we can share, the better that experience is going to be, and that includes saying where there are exceptions to the accessibility information or capabilities.
Yeah,
So,
limitations. It's important to explain limitations. We've all
yeah.
had the frustration of trying to purchase something and there's just not enough information and we don't know. Last thing we want to do in this day and age is have to contact somebody, because we all know what that's like when you actually have to contact contact this number for further information or write to us.
Yeah.
You know, it's about making the experience the same for everybody. That doesn't matter what your needs are, how you read, how you consume content. It's there and it's available for you, and you can make the same choices. Everybody can make the same choices.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's I think sometimes we get so caught up in the act and what do we have to do, that I think it's just worth sometimes reminding ourselves as why are we doing this other than the act. So yeah, thank you for bringing that to our attention as well. And the safety information is interesting. I wonder how many organizations have thought of the safety information with regards to flashing lights, moving, motion sickness, etc., all of that. So yeah, thank you, Chris. Really useful.
It's important if you produce content that has that.
Has that?
And
yes.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And it's very easy just even to say there may be a hazard.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So I think, Chris, you need to hand this screen back to me.
I have.
You have. Yeah, of course you have. Yes. What am I thinking? Great. Thank you. So now we're going to turn our attention to. So we've heard about standards. We've heard about best practices and recommendations, and lots of resources available to help you all with that. So what does that mean in practical terms? So now we're going to turn our attention to the publisher's perspective. And to this end, I'm inviting John Bell, Publishing Systems Manager at HarperCollins, and also Chair of BIC's Digital Committee, to take the virtual stage. And he's already here, so hi, John. John's going to share some of the background to HarperCollins' approach to eBooks and accessibility, both in terms of their general principles and then how they've applied those principles in practice. And we'll hear about the evolution of their frontlist accessibility metadata workflows, their approach to the backlist, the dreaded backlist, and how to become, I think you're going to touch as well on how to become accessible from the get-go, and hopefully people will sort of glean lots of hints and tips from you. So over to you, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karina. I should start by saying that I can't see the slides, Karina. Perfect, thank you. Lovely. I should start by saying that we don't have all of the answers at HarperCollins, definitely not. We know that we don't do everything perfectly, and everything I say today is a work in progress. We haven't pinned down exactly what we're doing for all of our books in terms of the Accessibility Act, but what I hope to give you today is just a short history of where we are and how we got there in terms of accessibility for our list, and what we're planning to do in 2024, 2025 going forwards. So a little bit of history. We started publishing ebooks very, very early, I think. 2001, we were publishing in formats that don't exist anymore. Rocket Books, Gemstars, Palm readers, Sony readers, all of these things came with a rucksack to carry the batteries and were generally not very accessible. And I don't think in those days we even thought about accessibility in those products we were making. We were keen to get to market, but not thinking about accessibility. We stopped doing all those crazy things in 2007 and switched to only publishing ePub 2s and some bespoke products for Kindle format, and Barnes & Noble had a format for a while called ePub. We did some of those, but the vast majority of our list from 2007 onwards was ePub 2, and we inherited a lot of ePub 2s through acquisition. In 2014, we bought Harlequin, as they're called in America, Mills & Boon in the UK, and that gave us some number of tens of thousands of ePub 2s that we hadn't made ourselves, but had been created by a company that we bought. So by 2014, we had a very large ebook catalog to think about. The big step for us in terms of accessibility came in 2019. We switched all of our ebook production to ePub 3, again with the small exception of some bespoke retailer-specific formats that we needed to do. But almost everything we made from 2019 onwards has been ePub 3. We've had no problems with that, no reader platform issues, no retailer problems. It was a very smooth transition for us. And at that point, we decided that at least all of our narrative content would be accessible, born accessible in the words that he used in the industry. So we made a conscious decision 2019 to explicitly try to be accessible, not accidentally be accessible. Could I have the next slide, Karina? And so, as I say, we wanted to be accessible, and we know that there's no point making accessible ebooks if you don't tell people that they are accessible, exactly as Chris said. The public purchasing these things, it's important they know what the book is going to do so that they know whether it will work for them. And for us at HarperCollins, that principle has a strong strategic alignment. We want our books to be available to everybody globally. We're a global publisher, and in every format that's appropriate so that we have the widest readership possible. That's a commercial imperative for us. We do all of our narrative books in audio as well as ebooks and as print books. We do lots of global print on demand. That's strategic. Get our content out as widely as we can. Is part of the deal, and there is a readership for whom accessible books are important that we want to be able to address. So there's a strategic element to our principles. We're very lucky that those principles are strongly supported inside the business, both by leadership. Charlie Redmayne, our CEO, is, I think it would be fair to say, passionate about inclusion, and obviously passionate about making money as well, hence the strategic element. But he's very interested in making sure that our products are as accessible as they can be, and can be read by as many people as possible. We're also very lucky that there's a lot of passion in this company from the bottom up. We have staff in the production teams who make the ebooks, in the digital teams who manage the workflow, and also in my technology team who care about this as well. And that makes a big difference. Having people who are actually interested and want to do the right thing makes a huge difference to your ability to succeed. And we're lucky in a way also, is this true? We're lucky in a way that we make our own ONIX in-house. We don't have a third-party system. So as we add new features to our title management system, we can put them into ONIX quickly. So we've been distributing the accessibility metadata in our own ONIX for many years. We're, I think, probably quite ahead of the game there, just because we can, because it's an in-house system that we do. Next slide, please, Karina. In practice, when we were doing ePub 2s between 2007 and 2019, they were quite good. And as Wendy said, that narrative things are very often accessible without even trying. As long as the text is in the right order and you have some kind of navigation in it, it's basically accessible. If the only pictures are a cover and a logo, it doesn't fundamentally change the experience of the book if you don't describe those images. But we know, HarperCollins, we're a very broad publisher. We have lots of books with lots of pictures in, and as Wendy said, if you have a map of Toronto, you should be trying to describe that. In our ePub 2 days, we were not doing that. So many of our illustrated books have no image descriptions whatsoever and are therefore not as accessible as we would want them to be. We also, for a while, did some silly things when we thought that maybe it would be nice if ePubs, if the ePub text looked more like the physical text. So we applied some paragraph styling that makes it quite difficult for readers to resize the text if they can see, but they need the type to be bigger, or they want ragged margins because that's better for dyslexic readers. We did some of that. We tried very hard to minimize it, but editors like things to look good in the traditional print sense of looking good. And we also sometimes embedded fonts, which makes it difficult for readers to choose a typeface that works for them. We've always been very careful about the legality of embedding fonts because you have to have special licenses to do that, but it's not great for accessibility. So in our ePub 2 days, we know that we weren't great. We weren't bad, but we weren't great. Could I have the next slide, please, Karina? As I said, 2019, ePub 3, we made a conscious choice. There were slightly fraught is not fair. Conversations about the cost of doing this, which we had to make a pitch for why should we make all of our text-only books fully accessible from the get-go, but we were successful because, as I say, there's passion in this business to do this right. So from 2019, from ePub 3, all of our narrative books have been fully accessible. We didn't do them all on day one, but all of our divisions worked towards that, and we are there now. We also made the choice to minimize the number of fixed format books that we produce. We still do, you'll see that further down on this slide, we still do fixed format for several good reasons, but wherever possible, even our illustrated books are reflowable, which makes them vastly more accessible. That's quite a big step because it means the ebook no longer looks like the print book at all, and that's quite a sort of mental step for publishers to make, but we did that, and it's been good. We know that we still weren't writing image descriptions for every image, not by a long chalk, so many of the books published in the last 5 years are reflowable, have good reading order, have navigation, but don't have image descriptions where they should. We're fully aware of that, and that's a problem for the Accessibility Act. We know that. And as I say, we still produce fixed format, particularly in children's books, but it's that point that Wendy made that's true of manga as well. If you need to see the full page spread to make sense of the book, it basically has to be fixed format, and there are limitations in how accessible a fixed format ebook can be. And again, we know that many of the fixed format books we've published over that time period don't have image descriptions because we weren't. There's work involved in writing image descriptions, and we weren't doing that work back then. Next slide, please, Karina. In those days, the 2019 to 2024 sort of workflow looked a little bit like this, and this is a workflow that works. You could do this yourselves regardless of the size of your publishing company, with the exception of the ONIX piece perhaps. Our editors got a PDF of the physical book and used that PDF as a reference so that they could write contextually sensible image descriptions of the images used in the book, put those into an Excel document, and that Excel document goes to the conversion vendor who makes the ePub for us. Most of our ePubs are made out of house, some internally, but most out of house. But that editorial process is very offline. Designer makes a PDF, editor looks at PDF and writes descriptions that fit the context for the images. And we had editorial managers manually entering the accessibility features into our title management system. So if they knew the book would have image descriptions because somebody in their team had written image descriptions, we'd have somebody enter that manually into our systems. There's obviously room for error there, and we've changed that, but that's a way of doing it, and it's important, as both the previous speakers have said, it's important not only to make the ePubs accessible, but to be able to tell people that they are. So we need to capture that information somehow. And then finally, where we know what features this book has, we will put that in our ONIX so that the market can make use of it, display it on websites and so on. This year, we've changed that workflow quite significantly, I think, thank you, Karina, perfect, next slide. We've built an in-house bespoke web tool to help with writing image descriptions that we now, instead of producing a PDF from the design workflow from InDesign, we export the JPEGs that will be used in the ebook. So it's a folder of small images. We pour those into a web tool that allows editors to look at each image in turn in the order it appears in the ePub, and write appropriate image descriptions. And as Chris has mentioned earlier, you can say in your metadata, this image is decorative and doesn't need to be described, or there are other criteria as well as just what is in the picture. So we built a tool to make that work easier, and the export from that tool is still Excel because that's what our conversion vendors like, but it's a very standardized Excel, which makes the work easier for everybody. And the other change we've made, instead of having editorial teams manually enter data into the title management system to say how accessible the ebook is, we are now getting the ePub back, pouring it into another home developed tool, and extracting from the ePub exactly how accessible it is. So it's no longer, there's much less error, there's no aspiration. Yes, we will have written long descriptions of every image, and then we didn't do that. We're now looking at the ePub itself to say, how accessible are you? recording that in our title management system. If it's not as accessible as we think it should be, because we are now asking all of our conversion vendors to make accessible ebooks, if there are issues, if it comes back full of CSS styling or something like that, we're flagging that and sending the ePub back for rework so that when we do put it out to market, it is as accessible as we want it to be. And of course, those accessibility features will go out. What we know about that ePub will go out in the ONIX message. Next slide, please, Karina. So Chris has talked a little bit about this already, but I just wanted to give two screenshots of the two pieces of metadata that we're talking about in that new workflow. So the back window here is from the inside of a HarperCollins UK ebook, ePub. It's the OPF file, which stands for Open Package Format, and it's a piece of XML inside the ePub that tells the reading platform some stuff about that ePub, title of the book. Does it conform to the WCAG standard? And you can see listed the accessibility features that this particular ePub, it's a National Trust illustrated book, the particular features that this book has, and the front window is those features translated into the ONIX code list 196 values that Chris showed earlier. And for us now at HarperCollins, that's it's coming from the ePub itself. So if the ePub doesn't say that it has image descriptions, we're not going to say that in the ONIX because it won't be true. Next slide, please, Karina. And my final piece of conversation, that's our front list. We're trying hard. We know that some things still won't be accessible because they're fixed format. There are still things we need to work on for the front list. But the big question for us as a big publisher, we have 50,000 live ebook titles. That's a lot. Many of them narrative only, but 50,000, it's a lot to worry about. What will we do for that backlist where we know that at least until 2019, not even the narrative ones are guaranteed to be as accessible as we wanted them to be? Our current plans, work in progress, as I said at the beginning, but our current plans are to explicitly take the top 500 ebooks that we know are not accessible and make them accessible, regardless of how hard that is. It doesn't matter whether it's a narrative book or a fully illustrated book. If it's in our top 500 selling right now, we want it to be accessible. Anything that comes back through our digital teams because a retailer has raised a complaint or a consumer complaint has come in and we need to rework it, if it's an inaccessible ePub 2, or actually even if it's an ePub 2, we're going to convert it to being an ePub 3. So anything that we're touching from now on is going to be an accessible ePub 3 if it's possible. That gets us a small amount of the way there, but we've still got 30,000 or whatever it is old ePub 2s to look at. And where we're starting with those, we don't know quite where we're finishing with those, but where we're starting is we're going to pull them all through the tool that extracts the accessibility information from the ePub itself, so that we know what's in them. We don't know that right now. We made them a long time ago. We bought them in from another company that we bought. We don't know how accessible they all are. We're going to find that out by pouring them through the tool and suck that information straight into our title management system so that we can include it in the ONIX. And exactly as Chris says, it's important to tell people when they're not accessible. So if we find that the books we were making in 2008 are actually all full of embedded fonts and CSS styling and have no image descriptions whatsoever, at least we'll be able to tell people that. What we will do about that, if it turns out to be true, remains to be seen. That there are things you can do. You can spend the money making them accessible. You can try and make a case for undue burden. So, and any highly illustrated book that's only selling a few copies each year, that there's clearly no financial reason to do that. So maybe there's an undue burden exception we can put into our ONIX for those. We'll find out. And the other thing, the most desperate thing you could do is just choose to not sell them in Europe. That's absolutely not our hope. We want to make sure that we can sell our books, but we don't know the answer to all those questions yet, because we don't know exactly what all of those books look like. That's where we are now at HarperCollins UK. Thank you, Karina.
Well, thank you, John, for sharing that. Really interesting to see the sort of the practical application of the standards and the best practices we've just been talking about. I just wanted to go back a little bit on you were talking about embedded fonts. Now, for those who may not know what they are you able to just say very briefly what an embedded font is and why it's not such a good idea?
Absolutely, yeah.
Accessibility.
Which end to start from? Ideally, for an accessible ebook, you want the reader to be able to choose the typeface that works best for them. And sometimes there are specific fonts that people use that are designed for making reading easier for dyslexic people. For other people like me whose eyesight is not what it used to be, I just want it to be bigger and I don't want it to have serifs. Thank you very much, so I can read it more easily. That's what you want for accessibility. The counter to that is, if you do that, there's no guarantee that the ebook will look anything like the physical book. And if you're coming from a publishing background and you spent your life worrying about good typesetting, those things don't always sit comfortably, I guess is the right word. So you can choose as the maker of an ebook to actually literally embed the font software into the ePub so that everybody who looks at it sees it the same way. And if you were doing that, you would also want to say, and it should be displayed in 12 point, not just in times, but in 12-point times, and this kind of line spacing, justified margins, and then it will look just like a print book. That would be great. Not at all accessible. We did a little bit of that just for the aesthetics, but actually at HarperCollins, most of our font embedding was to get around difficult characters. So sometimes we have books like Tolkien, Tolkien books, and they have their own alphabet. There's no way to display Tolkien's alphabet in standard HTML. ePubs are fundamentally HTML. So we had to embed the Tolkien font that had the Tolkien runes, or runes might not be the right word, but you know what I mean, the type that Tolkien used. Most of our embedding of fonts was for that kind of reason, where there didn't seem to be another good way of doing it, but sometimes we certainly just did it for the aesthetic reason of we want it to look more like the print equivalent, particularly for books with pictures in. That's it's harder to see something that just no longer looks like the print book at all, especially if you're like me, reading it at 28 point and wide line spacing and that's one picture per page, not very many words. So yeah, that's font embedding. And I mentioned in the slide, we'll put it in brackets in the slide, legally font embedding, because you can't just do that. If you feel like it because you wanted your book to appear in Times New Roman, you can't just do that unless you have a license to do it. So if people are doing that, be very aware of the legality of what you're doing as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And I think as well, what you've emphasized in your presentation is the importance of, the ePub file will have certain accessibility features and characteristics, which is great, but we need to be telling people what they are or what they're not. And again, that comes down to the dual aspect, isn't it? The ePub file or the ePub wrapper, and then the actual ONIX information, which is the information that most vendors will take to display on their websites and inform the reader, the user, the downloader, or the library borrower of what it is they're actually looking at and considering. So I think the dual aspect is really important.
And we're, it's clear from the slides, but we're keen to have those things as closely linked as possible so that they're true. We can aspirationally say, oh yes, they've all got long descriptions, but that's an aspiration.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, John. Thank you for that. Really useful to see the sort of practical application side of things. So finally, we're going back to Wendy to, so we've heard about the publisher's perspective, all of this accessibility standards, best practices, etc. In light of the Accessibility Act. We're going back to Wendy now to hear what COBA were doing in preparation for the EAA, in particular with regards to metadata. So back over to you, Wendy. Let me just get the right slides up for you, because that would be helpful. Here we go.
Thank you. And I couldn't resist a bit of a joke, because I do have a COBO hat. I just don't have a W3C hat, but COBO hat on and off because it's smushing my hair.
I love that. Literally, that's your COBO hat. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Got it. So what are we doing at COBO from the vendor perspective? So John and Chris gave excellent summaries of what should be happening with metadata and what should be happening on the publisher side. But the final step in the chain is the retail and reading system experience. And I'm going to talk a bit about what we're doing and hopefully give some insight on that. So our role in this is that final stage between the the publishers and the authors to the consumer, to the reader. Our the main things that we're doing for EAA and going forwards is to deliver accessible books and accessibility metadata to the reader, to build accessible experiences for readers, and that includes our website, our mobile applications, and our hardware, our e-reader devices, and to use accessibility metadata to help readers make informed buying decisions. And John and Chris both covered this really well. We want to ensure that the reader has all of the information that they need to make the best decision that they can for themselves, not only about the kind of book that they want to read, but also whether that book has the features and functionalities that they need to be able to read. Next slide. So what we're doing with accessibility metadata is we're receiving all of that ONIX metadata and even the internal ePub metadata from our publishers and our authors. And we are using it in a couple different places within our product experience. One of the, and there's two main ones. One is within search. So we are planning to add a filter to search that just, at least for now, just an accessible filter. So people can choose whether they will only want to see books that have been identified as accessible versus books that, just the rest of the catalog. And we're going to use that first to assess, how it is used and whether people actually like it. And then we may add future filters, but for now we're just doing this one. And then we're also planning on adding accessibility information to product pages on our website, our mobile applications, and our devices. The goal of this information is to obviously take all of that wonderful metadata from the ePubs and from ONIX and translate it for readers so that they know about conformance, about features, about any hazards or any additional information that's been provided to us so that they can make the best possible decision for themselves on whether or not this book is something that they might want to buy. Next slide. And the last part of this is reading experiences. So accessible ebooks are only half the story when it comes to accessible reading. Publishers like HarperCollins can do wonderful, amazing things with their ebooks, but that can all fall apart if the reading experience itself does not deliver on accessibility itself. So we are doing lots of work to ensure that all of our reading applications and our devices are accessible and can make sure that those accessible features that are built into the books can actually be used by readers. So this means also the entire workflow of getting from buying your book to actually reading it. And that means that they can they access their books? Can they download their books? Can they browse through their libraries to find the next book that they want to read? And then can they actually read the book itself? Reading experiences also, especially in relation to EAA, are responsible for features like text-to-speech, text adjustments, and media overlays. Without the reading system capability for those features would not exist. So we're adding a lot of new features to our reading systems over the next couple of months. And we are working really hard to ensure that all of the wonderful accessibility work that publishers are doing is reflected and shown to the user so that they can enjoy their books as well.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Wendy. Very quick, which I'm sure belies the amount of effort and work that's actually going on at Kobo. So it's brilliant that you're putting so much effort and time into this. And I just wanted to ask you in terms of just very quickly. Well, actually, no, I might save it for the Q&A session. So I'm just looking at the clock here. I'll keep that for the Q&A session. And just the one I was going to ask you in case there aren't any questions. I think there's a couple of questions coming through. So thank you for that. And this is going to be work, isn't it? That's just ongoing. It's like, It's not a question of, yes, we're ready for the EAA Act and job done. It's ongoing. It's you know, as the standards and the best practices develop and evolve over time, so do the platforms, or so the platforms will have to as well. The, you know, Kobo's platform will, publishers' work flows will have to adapt and change and respond to those changes as well. So it's not just a case of saying, right, we're EA ready, you know, pack up shop, we're done, you know, tick. It's an ongoing exercise. So yes, thank you for sharing your work to date. Very helpful to hear it from the vendor side of things as well. So now it's the Q&A session, everybody. So I'm just bear with me a second. I'm just going to check our question box. So let me have a look. So feel free, don't be shy, don't hold back. Remember, we can't answer any business or company specific questions, so we won't be answering those. Let me just have a quick scan now. First question.
Do you want to turn the camera on again?
Oh, that would be good, wouldn't it? Yes, thank you for the prompt there, Chris. Very helpful. So the first question I've got, I think is quite specific, but I'm going to see if I can generalize it. So we have somebody who's asking about, it's a schools related question, I think from a publisher, I can't actually tell, but they're talking about some pages may have 3 screenshots showing how to complete a task in Word or Excel, etc. Can we generalize, can they provide one alt text that covers the whole group of images? So I'm guessing generic alt text is the question. And then there's a bit more information, I think that's a bit specific that I won't go into, but just a general question, can generic alt text work? I think I already know the answer.
Yes. I think the alt text conversation, we probably could have a whole webinar just talking about ways to do alt text.
We have actually got one scheduled, so we can go dive into detail in that later. But yeah.
But I would say there's 2 ways. One is obviously to apply alt to the images themselves, and that's the most common way to do it, and still the best way to do it. But in cases like the one you described, where it's, you know, you maybe have multiple images, it's showing a workflow, it's maybe a little complex. This is one of those examples where it might be better to just mark those images as decorative and actually have separate text that walks through that process and say, you know, step 1, go to this, step 2, go to that, step 3, go to this. Because it's, the goal is obviously, you know, especially in a case like screenshots, you're showing someone how to do something. The, you know, person who is listening to the book as opposed to maybe looking at it visually is probably also listening for the names of buttons or the names of, you know, menu items.
Yeah. So you couldn't just put alt text screenshot, that wouldn't cover it.
You could, but it'd probably be more annoying than helpful.
Yeah, that's it. So I think it's, again, to the point I keep making is, it's, you really have to put yourself, if you can, or try and imagine yourself in the position of someone with accessibility needs. Are they going to have the same experience as a person without accessibility needs? If not, then you need to describe that image a bit more specifically or contextually. Thank you. Next question. And we know the answer to this one, I think, as well. John, your ePub accessibility metadata extraction tool, there's a lot of interest in this. It's in-house, isn't it? It's proprietary in-house. Yeah. Not available for sale.
We're saying it's not very difficult either. An ePub is just a zip. You know, it's like any other zip archive. So if you can write a script to unzip a zip, you can open an ePub, and the document we're reading from is the OPF. It's a standard XML format. So if you can write something to read XML, you can read the control out of that XML. Ours is proprietary, and we're not giving it away, but I'm sure that there are other vendors out there who could offer that service.
Yeah.
It's not a hard thing to do.
Yeah, thank you. Another one for you, John. Let me just quickly scan it. Okay, do HarperCollins record accessibility metadata in the title management system with the ONIX code lists, or do you have your own reference data and or values for accessibility?
Our title management system is very, very closely aligned to ONIX. It's an in-house system. It's very closely aligned to ONIX because that's what it was built for, to generate ONIX. So we're actually, on screen it looks like a bunch of tick boxes, but basically they're tick boxes for values in the ONIX code list. Roughly, Chris has shown you list 196. It's very, very long. We're not capturing all of that detail, in a UI, because that would be like screens of a UI, but it's very long, and then we have to do that crosswalk between the OPF data in the ePub to map it to ONIX values.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Looking at the EU directive, the document makes reference to ebook publishers but not libraries who loan digital titles. Is a relationship between the EAA and libraries made more explicit elsewhere? We may not be able to answer that one.
Look through the text of the EU directive, because it does, and I'm not a lawyer, but it does make reference to making available in the EU. So that you need to get somebody legal to look at it, but it does imply that it does apply to libraries, and of course libraries also come into other directives to do with supplying to schools, to education institutions. I think things like the Americans with Disability Act and things like that would have more implications. So libraries, that's why I said it could be covering libraries, but again, I'm not a lawyer.
That's a good point. Yes, we're not lawyers. This is not legal advice, so we would advise people to seek their own. Thank you. Let me just see what the next question is. Will a recording of this BIC brunch, I can do this one, this is an easy one. Will the recording of this BIC brunch be made available to attendees? Yes, it will. This one will. Hopefully that answers that question. Let me just scan this quickly. I think that's a bit commercially sensitive. I won't answer that one. Is there, and again, this is a library question, so we may not, our panel may not be able to answer this, but I will ask it anyway. Is there a MARC guideline for the accessibility standards? Do we know?
I know IFLA have a working group looking at accessibility in the library market. I can pass the information to Karina. You could pass it on to people. I don't know if you've got any.
That would be useful, I think. So if you, when we follow up, probably next week at this point, when we follow up with our with you as attendees on this webinar, we can include a link to that if people would find that helpful. Thanks, Chris. Does compliance with the EU Act require alt text for images, or does it simply require publishers to specify whether there is alt text or not?
Again, from reading the directive, and I recommend you go and read the directive. The language isn't difficult. It's actually written in quite accessible language, surprisingly enough. Go and read it and see what it says. It does mention alternative text. It's about putting the, go and look at the directive is what I recommend.
And keep in mind as well, this is about what is the person with accessibility requirements experiencing. If their experience is not the same as somebody without accessibility requirements, kind of irrespective of the Act in a way, it's good to make sure that that information is as comprehensive as possible.
And as with any user experience, if you put something in your metadata, or like, you know, I'm saying I've got alternatives and you don't, that's a bad user experience, and that's going to annoy the vendors as well as the readers. So, and it's better to say, look, it's got images, use list 81. I've got images, but don't put that you've got alternative text. And then you can see I've got images, but I don't yet have the alternative text. There's also a way of just sending a little description, explaining these are the accessibility features, but also it doesn't yet do this. Be open. Right.
Okay.
Let's emphasize that the idea is with the Accessibility Act, it's to get, its primary purpose isn't to punish people, it's to encourage better accessibility for everyone. To think of it's about making every consumer in the EU have the same rights and the same accessibility. There is punishment. They does provide for punishment, but that's not the primary purpose. So, you know, do what you can.
Be truthful.
Be honest.
Be truthful. Yeah. You stand to gain a lot more from being accessible and following the EAA and going beyond the EAA requirements as a company and as publishers and as platforms than not following it.
I have a question, Wendy. In your experience, if you're without naming names, obviously, what would you say, being on the receiving end, being the vendor here, what would you say are the most common sort of pitfalls to avoid or mistakes that you see, easy sort of quick wins that, you know, people can avoid? Or if we don't want to talk about mistakes, what are the quick wins that publishers that maybe are feeling overwhelmed with maybe they've got a huge backlist, or maybe you know, maybe they're a smaller publisher with not such a large list, but they're just feeling overwhelmed by all the documentation, all the standards, all the best practices, etc. What sort of nugget of advice would you give to publishers who perhaps haven't started yet?
Yeah, I would start with we've talked about it so much, alt text. Start with alt text. Add simple descriptions to your images, and it doesn't need to be your backlist right away. Start with your front list. Start with the books that you're working on right now or in the next year. Focus on those first. Get used to it. Get comfortable with it. Go from there. Adding some tools, like there's so many free tools out there. Ace by Daisy, ePub check. All of these things can help you catch little errors that you're making along the way and just make things a little bit easier on you. And you know, I'd say like the most common errors that we catch when we're looking at books really are around things like not including alt text, basic structural issues with books, you know, maybe not including headings for your chapters, or I've seen books where the TOC only points to the cover for some reason and there's no internal structure. You know, these are really little easy things to catch. Your tools can probably catch them for you, especially if you're using, you know, something like InDesign or anything like that. These things can do these things for you. Like, use your tools, leverage your tools. But just, you know, a little bit of quality control. Testing your books, even if maybe not all the books, but doing some testing. Doesn't have to be on every reading system, but do a little bit of testing. And you will catch a lot.
Okay, thank you. Good advice.
That last point, testing, is really important. You know, we have a cupboard full of devices here, and that's how we've, you know, over the years got better at this, is by testing. You know, just try it on the latest Kobo, try it on the latest Kindles, try it on the on-screen screen reader, and just see how it works. So do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Great. Lots of questions. I'm trying to filter. Quick one, hopefully. I know we're on the nose at 1:30. So are you all, you know, Chris, John, Wendy, are you still able to stay on for a little bit? Hopefully our attendees will be able to stay on for maybe just 5 more minutes. Quick one. Is it a legal requirement to provide accessibility data in the ONIX feed? Or in ONIX? I think this question is it a legal requirement to use ONIX?
No. my slide that had the quote, that's the text in the directive. There are standards that different enforcement bodies in the European Union recognise. Wendy's pointed out some of the WCAG standards, the ePub 3. ePub is recognised as a standard. You know, they recognise standards, but the directive doesn't name any particular standard. ONIX is recognised as the main standard for communicating metadata in the supply chain, so it's a good one to use, but it's not mandated. Nothing is no standard is named.
But you have to use something.
But you must use something.
Yeah.
Don't send a picture, for example.
Yeah. No. Thank you. And just another quick one. I think this is probably going to be for John. It's a question that came in separately before our event. So what is the current global retailer support for ePub 3? And what is the current global device support for ePub 3? Are you able to talk to that one, John?
I can tell you our experience. We said in the slides, we switched from ePub 2 to ePub 3 in 2019, and we wouldn't have done that if we weren't confident that we wouldn't lose consumers or sales or platforms or whatever. That's 5 years ago. I'm a little bit further away from the inside of an ePub than I'd like to be, but there are things you can do in your ePub 3 to make them backwards compatible with readers of ePub 2. I think the right words are NCX. Wendy's nodding. That's kind of reassuring. So it is certainly for simple ePub 3s, it's possible to make them work on an ePub 2 reader, and we do that. But our experience has been positive. It's not caused us any problems at all moving to ePub 3.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, and then we'll close. ePub Accessibility 1.1 includes reference to schema.org accessibility properties for discoverability vocabulary. Any thoughts on the pros and cons of using free text description of visual content versus controlled terms? To what extent have controlled vocabularies like schema.org accessibility properties proliferated into ePub metadata? That's quite a meaty question to end with. Who wants to take that?
It is a meaty question.
It is a meaty one.
Yeah. Schema.org is the schema.org vocabulary is what we use in the internal ePub metadata. I recommend it. I recommend ensuring that your metadata is good across within the ePub as well as in the ONIX, especially so on our platform where we prioritize ONIX over internal metadata, partly because ONIX is much more updatable. So if things change and for whatever reason, it's faster to update your ONIX than it is to update the internal ePub metadata because you have to send a whole new ePub to do that. But you should have internal ePub metadata because for us it becomes a fallback. But it also carries through with the file if it's ever taken off the platform. So if someone chooses maybe to download it onto their computer and use it somewhere else or use a different reader or any the things that people can do with eBooks as they should be able to do with eBooks. ONIX does not travel that way, but the internal ePub metadata will. So I highly recommend using both schema. The schema vocabulary as defined in ePub Accessibility 1.1 is the way to do it. And Chris, I believe, shared a link to the crosswalk. So if there's any concern about matching your internal metadata to your ONIX metadata, the crosswalk is there for you to reference.
I'd also add one thing to that. Wendy's absolutely right. Use schema.org metadata inside the ePub, use ONIX because they're standardized. They're based on consensus. People know, machines know what they mean. As soon as you start using your own words, what do you actually mean? You need to define what you mean by using that word so you make the process more complex. There are ways with base systems of adding your own text to give further details, but there's a reason we come up with standards.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'm going to have to call the session to a close as we are slightly over. So thank you, Chris, John and Wendy, for staying on a little bit later, and to the attendees that have stayed. In fact, quite a few of them have stayed on a little bit later, which is good. So let's just close this session properly. So we have run out of time. We've gone well, not well over, but we have gone over. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to say a massive thank you to our speakers. So on behalf of BIC and everyone in attendance, thank you to Wendy, Chris and John for taking the time to prepare and present today and to answer all the questions, or most of the questions. We've had quite a few questions coming through, which is great. We're going to make the slides for this event available on our website shortly anyway, but we will be emailing them separately to all the attendees today, and the recording of this webinar will be sent to all attendees realistically probably towards the end of next week. So if you don't get it immediately, don't panic, it will be with you. If you can just give us to the end of next week to get everything ready, that would be really appreciated. And it will be subsequently posted to our BIC YouTube channel anyway in about a month's time. So that will be available for everyone that hasn't attended today to have a look. If you're signed up to our mailing list, which the link is on the screen there, you'll be notified of when this has happened in one of our regular mailings. Finally, and there's just a reminder there about the PAAG conference later this month. Finally, to you, our attendees, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us today and for staying with us to the end. For those of you that did, please do stay in touch, join our mailing list, and you can find out more about what we do, more events, etc., etc. And we hope to see you at another BIC event in the near future. So take care until then. Bye, everyone.